Beirut, 1974. A passionate crowd of Arabs gathers for the funeral of one of their former leaders. Mohammed Amin al-Husseini was a controversial figure throughout his life. A man whose decisions fundamentally affected the lives of his people. At just 26, he rose to claim the title Grand Mufti, the spiritual and political leader of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs. He is a character who, even now, polarizes opinion, particularly between Jews and Arabs. To many Jews, he is a man who collaborated with the Nazis and provides clear proof that all Arabs utterly despise them. He clearly supported the extermination of millions of Jews. In his own words, he said, "Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion." He even went as far as recruiting Muslims to form a special division of the dreaded SS.
The Mufti, as he himself acknowledged very clearly in his memoirs, was perfectly aware of the genocide. He was perfectly aware of the fact that the Nazis were perpetrating a genocide of European Jews.
But to Arabs, he was a man simply seeking to protect his people's rights to a territory that is now no longer theirs. In fact, to many, he was a prophet who foresaw the destruction of his homeland and only wanted to defend it. So what were his motives? How much did he really support Hitler and the Nazis' intentions towards the Jews? It's not simply a matter of history, as the Grand Mufti's actions and influence have had a significant impact on the Middle East of today. Mohammed al-Husseini's story is rooted in the period in the Middle East between the First and Second World Wars. Al-Husseini was born into a family of wealthy landowners in southern Palestine, near the holy city of Jerusalem, with a long and proud history. At the start of the 20th century, the whole region was largely under Muslim control, with around 400,000 Muslims and as few as 25,000 Jews. The land had been part of the massive Ottoman Empire for 400 years. But during the First World War, the empire was broken up and Palestine was controlled by the British.
The British occupied Palestine during the First World War. It didn't exist as a political entity under the Ottomans. But the British decided by the end of the First World War that they wanted to dismember the Ottoman Empire. And it was quite clear to them that Palestine was of tremendous strategic significance in terms of the need to protect Egypt and the Suez Canal from any potential aggressor.
During the First World War, the British had made explicit promises to the Arabs in the Middle East that they wanted a new era for the Arab people. They even sent out leaflets in Arabic, proclaiming that they fully supported the idea that Arabs should run their own countries. For al-Husseini and other politically motivated Palestinians, it meant that they were more than willing to help the British cause.
You have to remember that Hajj Amin al-Husseini was not simply a bystander in the events of the end of the First World War. He worked with the British as an officer in the Sharifian Arab army in Palestine to recruit in the name of the cause of Arab national freedom fighting with the British. He was said to be very pro-British.
But this was a difficult time for those Arabs living in Palestine. They were witnessing more and more Jews settling in what they believed was their land. And even worse for the Palestinians, some of those Jews were hardline Zionists, Jews dedicated to the establishment of a solely Jewish nation. It was a situation that al-Husseini could not tolerate. In November 1917, the British made a political move that has repercussions even today. They issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration. It stated that the British government now favored the establishment in Palestine of a homeland for the Jewish people. So in other words, the declaration supported the idea of a country for the Jews. There was no reference to Arabs at all.
There's no mention of the Palestinian Arabs in the Balfour Declaration. They're simply referred to as existing non-Jewish communities. The reason for that is that British Middle East specialists, Orientalists of the period, didn't think that there was an actual Arab population in Palestine. They simply saw them as a degenerate bunch of mixed races, the terminology that was used during this period. They didn't see that this was a cohesive community in any sense.
For al-Husseini, the Balfour Declaration was devastating news. And it was this that would cause him to set out on the path that would ultimately lead him to collaborate with the Nazis. He wasn't prepared to stand by and see his homeland simply given away by the British. He decided to fight. During the Muslim festival of Nebi Musa in Jerusalem, an anti-Jewish riot broke out in protest at the Balfour Declaration.
This is the first case of large-scale violence between the two communities. Al-Husseini, after the Nebi Musa riots, is accused, particularly by the Zionists, of orchestrating the entire thing. The commission that investigated the course of the riots certainly believed that al-Husseini had a part to play.
Afterwards, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison by a military court. But he avoided jail, as he'd already fled the country.
This figures as part of a larger narrative that he's a troublemaker, that the Palestinian Arabs would have been okay with Zionism if it wasn't for these extreme Palestinian Arab nationalist leaders like al-Husseini, who throughout the mandate continually drive them towards extremism and violence against the Zionists.
Then in July 1920, the British made a move that would give al-Husseini hope. They appointed their first High Commissioner to Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel. It was an interesting choice.
He was a Liberal MP. He was the first Jewish member of the British cabinet. He was a high-profile politician. And during the First World War, he is the first person to submit a proposal to the British cabinet in support of the idea of the establishment of a Jewish state.
Despite his Zionist credentials, Samuel went out of his way to prove to the Arabs that although he was a Jew, above all else, he was fair. So he declared an amnesty for all Palestinian Arabs who had previously been sentenced by the British military. Still in exile at this point, al-Husseini could now safely return to his homeland. Then came another event that changed al-Husseini's life. His half-brother, Kamal, died suddenly. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian Muslims' spiritual leader. His funeral was a lavish occasion attended by thousands. His death left a serious power vacuum in Jerusalem. It was a situation that the British had to resolve quickly. Samuel realized that if there was any chance of creating stability in the region, then the right person had to be appointed as the Mufti's successor. Samuel wasted no time in selecting Mohammed Amin al-Husseini to fill the role. To enhance the authority of their chosen man, the British suddenly bestowed a brand new title on him. Not only would he be the Mufti of Jerusalem, he would be the Grand Mufti of Palestine. That is the spiritual leader of not only Jerusalem's Muslims, but of all Muslims in Palestine. It was a job for which he was barely qualified.
The kind of education that would be relevant to the post of Mufti is, of course, religious education, theology. And he didn't achieve this. He started, but he interrupted to go to serve in the army in the First World War and never resumed this education. So he has to be someone who very much learned in the Islamic theology, and that was certainly not the case with Amin al-Husseini. So this person who was designated as the Mufti of Jerusalem and Grand Mufti of Palestine by the British authorities in 1921 was barely 26 years old, so very, very young person for the job.
He was such an unlikely choice that even his own people didn't think him fit for the job.
He was not even part of the 3 persons that were selected according to the normal procedure by the community of religious persons in Palestine for the job. So he was just picked by the British High Commissioner for Palestine, Herbert Samuel, who happens to be a Zionist himself, actually, who picked just Amin al-Husseini and designated him in this job that the British authorities had renamed Grand Mufti of Palestine in order to stress the fact that this was the highest spiritual authority on the territory of their mandate.
But despite his lack of qualifications, al-Husseini took office on May the 8th, 1921. And from then onwards, his power and authority seems to keep on growing.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Within a year, he'd been elected president of the Supreme Muslim Council. At the age of just 26, he was now both the religious and political leader of the Arab community in Palestine, making him a hugely powerful player in the politics of the Middle East. At first, what looked like a high-risk appointment initially seemed to work. Al-Husseini worked hard to keep the peace. Towards the late 1920s, there were regular violent clashes between Palestinian Arabs and Jews. Jewish properties and even synagogues were attacked and destroyed. But the Grand Mufti was often seen attempting to restore order during the violence. Yet despite his attempts to keep the peace, there would soon be a dramatic turn of events that put him back on a collision course with the British. Those events occurred in Germany.
Sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
By March 1933, support for Adolf Hitler was growing at an unstoppable speed. He'd risen to take total power over the country. He brought democracy to an end, and now, for the first time as dictator, he turned his attention to his driving and overall ambition, the destruction of the Jews.
Des Bekenntnisses, ich glaube, sondern das Schwur, ich kämpfe.
He began by imposing a national boycott of Jewish shops and department stores. Then on the night of May the 10th, 1933, an event unseen in Europe since the Middle Ages occurred, as German students gathered in Berlin to burn books that were deemed to be Jewish. Later, Hitler introduced what became known as the Nuremberg Laws.
Unser Führer im Retter und Schöpfer, Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Deren Symbol Deutschland die Freiheit zurückgewonnen hat.
These severely restricted job opportunities for Jews, banned sexual relations between Jews and Germans, and in many cases, stripped Jews of their citizenship. Tens of thousands of Jews were forced to leave the country. One of their destinations was Palestine.
There can be no doubt that the major factor in providing the conditions for creating a Jewish state in Palestine has been the rise of Nazism to power, and concluded an agreement with the Zionist movement, which is called the Ha'avara Agreement, that is a transfer agreement, to organize the immigration of German Jews to Palestine, which is the only destination to which German Jews were allowed to move part of their belongings in the form of German goods, German products, bought and exported to Palestine.
In 1933, the number of Jews in Palestine rose to 209,000.
Because of the explosion of Zionist immigration in the beginning of the 1930s, this leads to, as a result, an explosion of Palestinian Arab anger and resentment. This is the real challenge for al-Husseini and other Arab leaders at the time. And as the Palestinian Arab population becomes more radicalized because of the situation in Palestine in the 1930s, by the middle of that decade, things really are clearly out of the control of the Palestinian Arab elite.
By 1937, the number of Jews had risen again. The figure now stood at 396,000. But rather than the Mufti blaming the Germans for this influx, the German consul general in Palestine, Heinrich Wolf, informed the Führer that Palestinian Muslims were making sympathetic noises towards the new Nazi regime. New Jewish communities with extensive building programs were continuing to populate Palestine. But news for the Arab population was about to get even worse. In London, the British government rejected a demand made by al-Husseini and other Arab leaders for an official council, designed to give them more control over their homeland. It was a bitter blow to their hopes of establishing a group to represent the views of the wider Palestinian Arab population.
The members of parliament who rejected the proposal of a legislative council did so because of the fear that this would undermine Britain's commitment to Zionism. And there was widespread belief in the Houses of Parliament that Zionism was per se a good thing. The members of Parliament continued to believe the old narrative that European migration in the shape of Zionist migration would raise the living standards of the Palestinian Arabs, that the Zionists were civilizing the backward Orient. And that was the spark that led to the uprising.
Arab leaders in Palestine now called for a general strike. It meant a total refusal to pay taxes and a countrywide strike of all Arab workers and businesses. The Arab leadership quickly organized themselves to coordinate further political demonstrations and strikes. They formed the Arab Higher Committee. Its role, to make demands of the British government during the unrest. The head of this new organization was the Grand Mufti himself. The Grand Mufti declared that the strike would continue until all Jewish immigration into Palestine was stopped. During the summer of 1936, the strikes brought the region to a standstill. Shops and businesses were forced to close throughout Palestine. It immediately caused widespread unrest. As violence broke out, the country's infrastructure was smashed. The transport network was sabotaged. British troops were sent in to quell the rising violence. They targeted Arab gangs who were attacking Jewish communities indiscriminately. It was the start of a 3-year-long bloodbath that became known as the Arab Revolt. During that first summer, thousands of acres of Jewish farmland were destroyed. The British tried in vain to keep the peace. But by October of 1936, with the revolt already 6 months old, an estimated 1,300 people had been killed. The British set up and dispatched a committee to the region, known as the Peel Commission. Its task was to investigate the reasons for the clashes and to come up with solutions. But their recommendations would only make things worse for the Palestinians.
The Peel Commission came to conclusion, including recommendations which were very clearly tailored according to the wishes of the Zionist movement. That is the partition of Palestine. That was the first clear pronouncement from a British source, official source, on the issue of partition. And of course, that was vehemently rejected by the Palestinians, including the Mufti.
The new map gave the Jews their own land in the north, with the British retaining the area around Jerusalem. Fearing that their country was about to be carved up, violence again flared in the region. In 1937, al-Husseini was deposed as president of the Supreme Muslim Council by the British authorities, and the Arab Higher Committee was declared illegal.
Unrest in Palestine. Suspecting that the Higher Committee had incited Arab leaders to start a holy war against the British government, police swooped on the secret headquarters of assassins and rebels. Many arrests were made. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, head of the Muslim Supreme Council, was deprived of office. The frontiers are guarded with special vigilance. All roads leading to Jerusalem patrolled. The British government is determined to stamp out terrorism.
Warrants for the arrest of the leaders of the committee were issued, but the Grand Mufti escaped to the Haram, the holy area of the city, where he was untouchable by the British. After 3 months in hiding, he fled the country and began a tortuous journey that would end at the very heart of the Nazi regime.
He's staying in Syria, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Foremost in the Palestine-Arab trouble, he eluded the British and escaped from the Mosque of Omar.
Now in exile in Syria, he continued to direct the war against the British. But British troop numbers were too small to crush the revolt. Strikes, sabotage, assassinations, and the guerrilla warfare went on without let-up. The British military presence was small in comparison to the Palestinian Arab forces. They were being overrun. But then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain found a new way of freeing up extra troops. He signed a deal with Hitler, giving him part of Czechoslovakia. Allegedly, this made Europe safe from the threat of war. With more than 20,000 troops, 3 RAF squadrons and 4,000 police, the British now began to squeeze the life out of the Arab Revolt. Villagers accused of sheltering Arab rebels had their houses blown up. Those Arabs suspected of taking part in the fighting were killed or beaten. Thousands of men were rounded up and imprisoned in detention camps without trial. At least 112 Arabs were hanged for taking part in the rebellion. According to official figures, by the spring of 1939, when the revolt effectively ended, the British had killed more than 2,000 Arabs.
The British crush the Arab uprising, which was the most significant challenge to British imperial authority in the 1930s, and a testament to the Palestinian national movement at that time. But because of the extent of British military suppression of that revolt and the brutality of that suppression against the Palestinian Arab people, you end up with a floundering Palestinian Arab movement after the revolt and going into the Second World War. And the movements of al-Husseini after the revolt are really a testament to that floundering of the Palestinian Arab national movement that's completely lost after the revolt and after it being crushed by the British.
But then in May 1939, the British government did an amazing U-turn. With Europe now back on the verge of war, they realized that they simply did not have enough men and machines to defend the Suez Canal and the precious oil fields of Iraq and Persia, as well as fighting Arab rebels in Palestine. Arab public opinion in the Middle East needed to be appeased. So they produced a paper calling for strict limits on Jewish immigration and the creation of an independent Palestine by 1949. Here was an offer that seemed to give al-Husseini and his freedom fighters everything they'd asked for.
The 1939 White Paper was seen by many Palestinian nationalists, including some radical nationalists, as a real achievement of the fight that has been waged by the Palestinians ever since the start of the revolt, the Great Revolt in 1936.
It was a sharp curtailment of Jewish immigration that was going to be limited to 75,000 over the following 5 years. And also a commitment that in 10 years' time there would be an independent Palestinian state.
They really saw in the White Paper the outcome of these years of struggle and the very high cost that they had to pay for that in lives and you know, in repression and all that.
This was a real chance for the Mufti to get what he wanted. Such was his hatred of the British that he dismissed their efforts to attempt to win him over. He rejected the White Paper's recommendations, and he went much further. He called for an end to the British mandate in Palestine. He wanted the British out and the creation of a single Arab state. The forces that propel him to collaborate with the Nazis were now inevitable.
He had his own selfish personal ambitions above any considerations of the real interest of his people and the movement. I'm saying that because, again, many nationalist leaders of the Palestinians considered that the White Paper should have been accepted, and at the time were in favor of expressing approval of the White Paper and seeing in the White Paper a victory of the movement.
Now the Grand Mufti was effectively at war with the British, and he desperately needed allies. He gave a clear indication of who they might be. Al-Husseini was quoted as saying, "What do we care who backs us, or who we align ourselves with, as long as it helps us to attain our goals? We have a common enemy, the British and the Jews."
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
As the war began in Europe, Al-Husseini's deteriorating relationship with the Syrian authorities forced him to move on from his base in Damascus. This time, he made for the Kingdom of Iraq. In Baghdad, he continued his political agitating, and in 1941 was involved in an anti-British revolt. From his base in Iraq, he issued a fatwa for a holy war against Britain. But just days later, British troops invaded Iraq, and al-Husseini was forced to move on yet again. This time, he made for Fascist Italy, where he met with the country's dictator, Benito Mussolini. Whilst in Italy, the Grand Mufti prepared a declaration confirming his support for the Axis powers. He was officially declaring his allegiance to the Nazis and their supporters. Within days, it had been sent to the German embassy in Rome. And on the 6th of November 1941, the Grand Mufti entered Berlin for the first time to meet directly with German officials.
When the Mufti arrived in 1941 in Berlin, he was, of course, greeted by many Nazi officials, especially those who were in touch already with him and in charge of operations in the Middle East, the political and strategic operations of Nazi Germany in the Middle East. But he, of course, requested to meet the Führer. He believed that his own stature meant that he had to meet in person the chief of the Nazis. The Hitler was not very much enthused about this idea of meeting a person like that.
Although reluctant to meet in person with the Grand Mufti, Hitler was told by his advisors that it might be useful in convincing him to help Germany win over the Arab population of the Middle East. So on November the 28th, 1941, the Grand Mufti was ushered into a private room in Hitler's chancellery. Surrounded by Nazi dignitaries, he finally met the Führer. It wasn't a long meeting, but al-Husseini appeared to get what he so desperately wanted.
Hitler was saying, give me some time, let us develop our military strategy, and when we'll be in the military position of dominating this part of the world, we will fulfill your desires of independence. But until then, I have political considerations, so you have to accept my pledge, and that's it. And this was the only meeting Hitler ever gave the Mufti.
The deal was pretty clear. While the Nazis stopped short of actually recognizing an independent Palestine, Hitler was planning to deal with the Jews who'd settled in the country. And so began the Mufti's 4-year-long relationship with the Nazis. Throughout his time in Germany during the Second World War, al-Husseini appeared to enjoy a close working relationship with some of the highest-ranking Nazis. In the Grand Mufti's memoirs, published in 1999, he freely discusses his close relationship with SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, the man who was the architect of the extermination of the Jews. According to his own account, he often met Himmler for tea. On one such occasion, the Grand Mufti had his photograph taken with him. It contains a signed dedication from Himmler to His Eminence the Grand Mufti, a memento. This wasn't the only exchange of gifts between Mohammed al-Husseini and the Nazi leaders. The Grand Mufti even went to such lengths as having a Persian rug specially made for the Führer himself. From his bureau in Berlin, he also planned a series of radio broadcasts to the Middle East. His first came in December 1941, and he continued to broadcast throughout the entire war. But then his involvement with the Nazis became deeper and darker. In 1942, Himmler's deputy Reinhard Heydrich convened a meeting of Nazi officials who met here at Wannsee, near Berlin. At the meeting, the Nazi hierarchy launched their project to deal with the millions of Jews in Europe. They rubber-stamped the plan which became known as the final solution to the Jewish problem. It meant the systematic rounding up of Jews and their extermination in death camps all over Europe. So what did the Grand Mufti really know of the Nazis' plans?
The Mufti, as he himself acknowledged very clearly in his memoirs, was perfectly aware of the genocide. He was perfectly aware of the fact that the Nazis were perpetrating a genocide of European Jews. He tells himself in his memoir the story of his encounter in July 1943 with Himmler, during which Himmler told him that Germany was in the process of exterminating the Jews and had already killed 3 million of them. He himself recognizes that he knew. He was informed about that, at least in July 1943.
Whilst there is no evidence of the Grand Mufti actively assisting Hitler's plans, he certainly did help the Nazi war effort.
Über den Bergen von Bosnien. Deutsche Kampfflugzeuge zerstören die Schlupfwinkel kommunistischer Banditen.
As the Second World War progressed and Germany began to suffer defeats, their troops became more and more stretched. One area of conflict where there was a desperate need for military support was the Balkans. There, the communist partisans were growing in strength. The Germans needed more resources urgently, especially soldiers. One possible solution was the drafting of Bosnian Muslims. But they had been strictly forbidden by Muslim leaders from collaborating with the Nazis. So the German authorities turned to their trusted Muslim voice, the Grand Mufti, to exert pressure on the power brokers in the region. In the spring of 1943, the Mufti successfully convinced Bosnian Muslims to ignore the clerics. By doing so, he played a major role in establishing a new unit of the SS, the most feared and fanatical part of the German armed forces. It was the SS that was responsible for some of the most brutal and horrendous crimes perpetrated in the whole of the war. The unit that the Grand Mufti helped set up became known as the 13th Waffen-SS Mountain Division and consisted almost entirely of Muslims. However, again, there is no evidence that this unit was actively involved in any anti-Jewish atrocities. But the Grand Mufti went further. He wrote letters to European leaders urging them not only to stop sending their Jewish citizens to Palestine, but to actively redirect them to Poland.
He knew that there were concentration camps. That was publicly known. And therefore, he was advocating that the Jews be sent to concentration camps instead of being sent to Palestine. So we can see here the qualitative difference between a Palestinian national leader who would say to any governments, don't send your Jews to Palestine. That's one thing. And a Palestinian leader would say, don't send your Jews to Palestine, but send them to Poland in concentration camps. Here you move from what could be seen as a legitimate national position or nationalist position into a criminal statement. And indeed, the Mufti had a very abject role during those years. There's no way, therefore, one can excuse him for that or find any justification.
The Mufti's justification was probably to get help in his efforts to attack the British in his homeland. He asked the Nazi hierarchy to organize sabotage missions against the Allies in the Middle East. His requests met with some success. Teams of saboteurs were parachuted into Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, where they targeted Allied facilities such as telephone lines, pipelines, bridges, and railways. But when he asked the German Air Command to carry out bigger raids along the Palestine coast and on Tel Aviv, he was less successful. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, rejected the plan, saying he simply didn't have enough men and machines to divert from Europe. But despite being let down by the Nazi hierarchy that he had come to trust, he continued to throw his support behind them. On March 1st, 1944, during one of his many broadcasts, he said, "Arabs, rise as one man and fight for your sacred rights. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. This saves your honor. God is with you."
We are not here dealing with, let's say, a kind of average nationalist leader fighting for the independence of his nation, for the liberation of his nation, and willing to make some tactical compromises or alliances for that purpose. No, we are dealing with somebody who believed in a real convergence between himself, what he represented, and the Nazis on the terrain of anti-Semitism.
And the drive goes on. Hanover is captured, and civilians wave white handkerchiefs and line the streets to watch a victorious army rumble through to the east.
As the Second World War drew to its conclusion in the spring of 1945, it became clear to the Grand Mufti that defeat for Hitler and the Nazis was only a matter of time. Al-Husseini had escaped capture before, and he was about to do it again.
This is the defeat of Germany. Facing Air Chief Marshal Tedder and Marshal Zhukov is a conquered German general. Keitel signs the surrender.
Just a day after Germany surrendered to the Allies, Al-Husseini boarded a plane for neutral Switzerland. But he was denied political asylum and moved swiftly on to Paris. A year later, in the spring of 1946, the Grand Mufti's actions during the war were examined at the Nuremberg Trials.
The Mufti was not indicted as part of the Nuremberg Tribunal and all that. There wasn't enough evidence accumulated against him despite the efforts of course, the Zionist movement. The fact is that, of course, Amin al-Husseini did everything I mentioned in terms of propaganda, contribution to the propaganda. He was a close collaborator of the Nazis, but he was not himself directly involved in war crimes.
Now the Grand Mufti beat one more hasty retreat, this time to the Egyptian capital Cairo, where he was finally given political asylum and a hero's welcome. So what is one to make of the Grand Mufti of Palestine? To some, he was simply a committed nationalist religious leader, one who was driven into the arms of the Germans by an unsympathetic British government, which repeatedly let him and his people down. They see him as a man faced with losing everything he'd promised his people he would protect. A man who would go to any lengths to see his Palestine remain solely in the hands of the Arabs.
Some people in the Arab world had tried to, if not justify, at least to find attenuating circumstances for the Mufti's collaboration with Nazism through the famous saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
But to others, his relationship with the Nazis is damning.
When you know about the nature of the force with which you are allying, and this force is committing such a huge crime against humanity, then this enemy of my enemy does not really hold water as an argument. The abjection, the abomination of collaborating with such a regime is clear.
Amin al-Husseini never returned to Jerusalem after his escape in 1937. The Grand Mufti of Palestine eventually died in exile in Beirut in 1974, aged 79. His place as leader of the Palestinian Arabs was eventually taken by a relative, Mohammed Yasser Abdul Rahman al-Husseini, better known as Yasser Arafat. In August 2002, Arafat gave an interview in which he referred to Mohammed al-Husseini as a symbol of Palestinian Arab resistance. He called him simply a hero. But it's not a view shared by many.